At 11:47 a.m. February 21st, 1945. Private First Class Harold Gonsalves crouched in a foxhole on Hill 362A, Iwo Jima, watching 34 Japanese soldiers emerge from the volcanic ash 200 yards downslope. His platoon had retreated 15 minutes earlier. His machine gun held 200 rounds. In the next 43 minutes, every attacking soldier would be dead, and Gonsalves would hold a position. Military analysts later calculated had a 2% survival probability for a lone defender. The morning had started with standard orders: advance, dig in, hold the volcanic ridgeline against counterattack. By 10:30 hours, those orders had collapsed under a barrage of mortar fire that killed 6 men in Gonsalves' squad and wounded 11 others, including his platoon sergeant. The lieutenant called retreat. Everyone pulled back except Gonsalves, who stayed in his position, feeding a fresh belt into his Browning M19-19A4 machine gun. Nobody ordered him to stay. Nobody expected him to survive. Harold Gonsalves grew up in Alameda, California, working the docks alongside Portuguese fishermen who'd taught him that some things you don't abandon. His father operated a crane loading cargo ships. His uncle repaired diesel engines in warehouses that smelled like grease and salt water. Gonsalves learned machinery before he learned algebra, could field strip a motor before he turned 16. He understood systems, pressure points, failure rates, how things broke, and how they held. He'd enlisted in 1943, at age 19, joining the Marine Corps because his older brother had died at Guadalcanal, and someone needed to finish what Tommy started. Boot camp revealed what his sergeant called problematic initiative. Gonsalves didn't follow orders he considered tactically stupid. He'd been written up twice for arguing with officers about defensive positions, once for redesigning a firing line without permission. The captain had told him, "Marines follow orders, Gonsalves. They don't redesign them." But Gonsalves kept doing it anyway, because he'd watched men die following bad orders, and he understood something the officers didn't. Most military doctrine assumed soldiers would behave predictably. Gonsalves had learned on the docks that systems failed when you followed rules that didn't match reality. Iwo Jima had proven that point repeatedly. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, sulfur vents, and Japanese soldiers dug into tunnels the Marines couldn't see until they started shooting. Standard tactics said advance, suppress, overwhelm. Those tactics had killed 4,000 Marines in 3 weeks. Gonsalves had watched friends die following doctrine that assumed visible enemies and conventional defensive positions. His closest friend, Private Eddie Kowalski from Pittsburgh, had been killed on February 19th, advancing across open ground toward what Intel called lightly defended positions. The position had contained 12 Japanese soldiers with interlocking fields of fire. Kowalski took 3 rounds through the chest before his squad could retreat. Gonsalves had carried the body back, felt Eddie's blood soak through both their uniforms, listened to the lieutenant explain. It was acceptable losses given tactical objectives. 2 days later, Corporal James Whitmore from Atlanta died when a mortar round hit his foxhole during what command had designated a consolidation phase with minimal enemy contact. The minimal contact had included 40 Japanese soldiers emerging from tunnels nobody knew existed. Whitmore had been writing a letter home when the shell landed. Gonsalves found pieces of the letter afterward, stuck to volcanic rock with blood. Then there was Private First Class Ray Martinez from El Paso, killed on February 20th. When ordered to hold a ridgeline position, that had no cover, no supporting fire, and clear sight lines for enemy mortars. Martinez had told the sergeant the position was suicide. The sergeant had said orders were orders. Martinez died holding that position for 11 minutes before shrapnel from a knee mortar cut his throat. Gonsalves had been 30 yards away, watching it happen, unable to help, because he was pinned down by machine gun fire from caves. His map said didn't exist. By February 21st, Gonsalves had watched 16 men from his company die following tactics designed for European warfare against an enemy fighting Pacific Island warfare. The doctrine said, advance and hold. The reality said the Japanese controlled the underground, emerging wherever they wanted, disappearing before artillery could respond. American forces kept taking positions they couldn't defend because the enemy wasn't where the positions assumed they'd be. The system was broken. Gonsalves understood broken systems. On the docks, when a crane malfunctioned, you didn't keep operating it according to the manual while cargo fell into the bay. You shut it down, found the problem, fixed it. But the Marine Corps didn't work that way. You followed orders even when the orders got people killed. That morning, the lieutenant had ordered the platoon to hold Hill 362A, a volcanic ridge that offered clear sight lines, but no cover except shallow foxholes scraped into ash and rock. Intelligence said Japanese forces had withdrawn from this sector. The mortar barrage at 10:30 hours proved intelligence wrong. 30 seconds of incoming fire killed or wounded half the platoon. The lieutenant, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to both legs, ordered everyone to fall back 200 yards to a more defensible position. Gonsalves stayed in his foxhole. He watched his squad mates retreat, crawling through volcanic ash under sporadic rifle fire. He could have gone with them, should have gone with them. The lieutenant had given a direct order, but Gonsalves looked downslope and saw what would happen if they abandoned this position. The Japanese would take the ridge, establish mortars, rain fire on American positions below. More men would die. More Kowalskis, Whitmores, Martinezes. So he stayed, checked his ammunition. 200 rounds in the current belt, 400 more in the ammunition box. Grenades, 6. Rifle, M1 Garand with 40 rounds. Water, 1 canteen, half full. The foxhole was 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, scraped into volcanic rock that provided minimal protection. If the Japanese brought mortars or called artillery, he'd die in the first salvo. If they rushed his position from multiple angles, he'd run out of ammunition before he could stop them all. The math was clear. This was suicide. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the machine gun's traverse, setting the field of fire to cover the main approach slope. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air. He could still retreat, catch up with the platoon, follow orders like Marines were supposed to do. Nobody would blame him. Staying here violated basic tactical doctrine about unsupported positions. But Eddie Kowalski had followed doctrine. So had Whitmore and Martinez. They were dead because the system assumed things about the enemy that weren't true. Gonsalves didn't trust the system anymore. He trusted his eyes, his hands, and the machine gun that weighed 41 pounds and fired 450 rounds per minute when properly maintained. He'd maintained it obsessively. Every night after combat, he'd field stripped the weapon, cleaned every component, checked feed mechanisms, adjusted headspace, verified timing. The other Marines had called him paranoid. The sergeants had appreciated it, but thought he overdid the maintenance. Gonsalves didn't care what they thought. He'd learned on the docks that machines failed when you trusted them without verification. This machine wouldn't fail because he wouldn't let it fail. At 11:47 hours, the first Japanese soldiers appeared 200 yards downslope, emerging from a cave entrance concealed behind volcanic rock. Gonsalves counted them. 34 men in infantry formation, carrying Arisaka rifles and what looked like knee mortars. They moved cautiously, probably expecting American forces to have fully retreated. They hadn't spotted his foxhole yet. Gonsalves settled behind the machine gun, fingers resting on the trigger, watching them advance. Standard doctrine said wait for optimal range, around 100 yards, then open fire. But Gonsalves had learned that doctrine assumed supporting fire from adjacent positions. He had no support, no backup, no reinforcements. If he waited for optimal range and they spotted him, they'd spread out, establish covering positions, bring up mortars. He'd be dead in minutes. So he violated doctrine again. At 180 yards, he opened fire. The Browning roared, recoil hammering against his shoulder as tracers arced downslope. The first burst caught 3 soldiers in the open, dropping them before they understood where the fire originated. Gonsalves traversed left, stitched another burst across a group, clustered near a rock outcropping. 2 went down. He swung right, fired again, saw volcanic ash explode around running figures. The Japanese scattered, diving behind rocks, returning fire. Bullets snapped overhead, impacted the rim of his foxhole. Gonsalves ignored them, focused on the machine gun. Short controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds each, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. He'd fired 60 rounds in 40 seconds, 140 remaining in the current belt. The enemy established positions behind rocks and in shallow depressions, began organized return fire. Rounds cracked past his head, struck the volcanic ash beside his foxhole. One bullet hit the machine gun's water jacket, punched through without penetrating the barrel. Gonsalves felt the impact vibration through his hands, kept firing. A Japanese soldier rose to throw a grenade. Gonsalves put 5 rounds through his chest before the grenade left his hand. It detonated among the rocks, killing 2 more soldiers who'd been sheltering there. 90 rounds left in the belt. Gonsalves reached for the ammunition box, began feeding a fresh belt while maintaining awareness of enemy positions. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of practice repetitions. 15 seconds to change belts. The Japanese used those 15 seconds to advance, rushing forward while he couldn't shoot. They closed to 140 yards before the fresh belt locked into place. Gonsalves opened fire again, caught the advancing group at close range, dropped 4 in quick succession. The others dove for cover, but they were closer now, their rifle fire more accurate. A round hit the foxhole rim 6 inches from his face, spraying volcanic ash into his eyes. He blinked it away, kept shooting, swinging the gun in controlled arcs, denying the enemy any safe position within 200 yards of his foxhole. The machine gun barrel was heating up, steam rising from the water jacket. Gonsalves could feel the weapon's temperature increasing through his grip. Standard doctrine said barrels should be changed every 200 rounds sustained fire. He had no spare barrel, no assistant gunner, no water to refill the cooling jacket. If the barrel overheated and warped, the gun would jam or explode. He'd be defenseless. So he controlled his fire rate, shorter bursts, longer pauses between bursts, letting the barrel cool fractionally between shots. It cost him suppressive effectiveness, but preserved the weapon. The Japanese recognized the decreased fire rate, attempted another advance. Gonsalves met them with precisely aimed bursts, dropping the leaders, forcing the others back. They'd lost 18 soldiers now. 16 remained. At 12:03 hours, the enemy changed tactics. Half their force maintained suppressive fire, while the other half maneuvered right, attempting to flank his position. Gonsalves spotted the movement, traversed the gun, engaged the flanking element. The machine gun's effective range was 1,500 yards. At 120 yards, it was devastating. 3 soldiers went down in the first burst. The others retreated to covered positions, unable to advance under direct fire. But the suppressive fire from the main group intensified. Rounds hammered his foxhole continuously, forcing him to keep his head down, limiting his ability to acquire targets. He fired blind, raising the gun barely above the foxhole rim, spraying the main enemy position with unaimed bursts. Wasteful, inefficient, but it kept them pinned, prevented coordinated assault. 400 rounds expended, 200 remaining. Gonsalves grabbed his rifle, fired several aimed shots at visible targets, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down while he fed the last ammunition belt into the machine gun. His hands were black with gun oil and volcanic ash slippery with sweat. The belt didn't seat properly on first attempt. He cleared it, tried again, felt it lock into place. The Japanese threw grenades, short-range mortars landing around his position. One detonated 5 yards to his left, showering him with rock fragments that cut his face and hands. Another landed directly in front of the foxhole, failed to detonate. Gonsalves kicked it away, watched it roll down slope, explode harmlessly among rocks. He resumed firing before the smoke cleared. 10 soldiers remained visible. The others were either dead, wounded, or concealed. Gonsalves methodically engaged each visible target, short bursts, conserving ammunition. A Japanese soldier attempted to use a knee mortar. Gonsalves killed him before he could fire. Another tried to advance under covering fire. Gonsalves hit him at 80 yards, center mass, watched him fall, and not move. At 12:18 hours, the enemy pulled back, retreating to positions 250 yards downslope, beyond effective rifle range, but still within machine gun range. Gonsalves fired several bursts to discourage regrouping, then stopped to assess. His ammunition box was nearly empty. Maybe 70 rounds left. His rifle had 16 rounds remaining. Grenades, 4, having thrown 2 at clustered targets during the firefight. His foxhole was destroyed, the rim blown away by grenades and mortars, offering minimal cover. The machine gun's water jacket was nearly dry, barrel so hot he could see heat shimmer rising from the metal. His hands were bleeding from rock fragments, face cut in a dozen places, left ear ringing from a near-miss explosion. He was exhausted, thirsty, and completely alone on a volcanic ridge against an enemy force that had pulled back to regroup, but hadn't retreated. They'd be back, probably with more soldiers, definitely with better tactics, now that they understood his position and capabilities. The smart move was to retreat now, while they were reorganized, get back to American lines before they launched another assault. But Gonsalves looked at the ground he'd held, the bodies scattered across the volcanic slope, and understood that retreating meant abandoning this position to an enemy that would use it to kill more Marines. So he stayed, redistributed his remaining grenades for easier access, checked his rifle, fed the last 70 rounds into the machine gun, drank half his remaining water, waited. At 12:29 hours, they came again. 15 soldiers, different group, fresh troops from the tunnel system. They'd learned from the first assault, advanced in short rushes between covered positions, maintained dispersed formation. Gonsalves let them close to 100 yards before opening fire. The machine gun hammered, tracers cutting through volcanic ash haze. He dropped 3 in the first burst, wounded 2 more. The others went to ground, returned fire. Gonsalves fired in short controlled bursts, each one precisely aimed at visible targets or likely covered positions. 50 rounds, 40, 30. The barrel was glowing dull red, water jacket completely dry, metal so hot it was warping. He could feel the weapon losing accuracy, rounds impacting 6 inches right of where he aimed. 20 rounds, 15. He killed another soldier attempting to flank left. 10 rounds remaining. The Japanese rushed his position, 5 soldiers advancing in coordinated assault, while their support element provided covering fire. Gonsalves emptied the machine gun into them, killed 2, wounded 1. The gun clicked empty. He grabbed his rifle, fired 8 shots in rapid succession, dropped another attacker at 40 yards. 3 soldiers still advancing, 30 yards out. Gonsalves threw a grenade. It detonated among the advancing troops, killing 1, wounding another. 2 soldiers remaining, 20 yards out. He fired his rifle, missed, the weapon's sights misaligned from being dropped during grenade throw. Fired again, hit 1 soldier in the shoulder, didn't stop him. 10 yards. Gonsalves threw his last 2 grenades simultaneously, watched them arc through volcanic ash, detonate among the charging soldiers. When the smoke cleared, both attackers were down, one still moving. Gonsalves shot him with his rifle. The soldier stopped moving. Silence. Gonsalves reloaded his rifle with his last 8 rounds, scanned the slope. Bodies everywhere. 34 confirmed dead, scattered across 200 yards of volcanic ash and rock. No movement, no additional troops emerging from caves. The assault had stopped. He sat in his ruined foxhole, hands shaking, ears ringing, bleeding from multiple cuts, and 1 piece of shrapnel embedded in his left forearm. The machine gun was destroyed, barrel warped, water jacket cracked, receiver damaged from overheating. His rifle had 8 rounds. No grenades, no water. If they came again, he'd die. They didn't come again. At 12:47 hours, American voices called from upslope. His platoon returning, advancing cautiously, rifles ready. They'd heard the sustained firing, seen the Japanese retreat, couldn't believe 1 man had held the position. The lieutenant, bandaged and limping, stared at the bodies covering the slope. "Jesus Christ, Gonsalves," he said quietly. "What did you do?" Gonsalves said nothing. He sat in his foxhole, hands still shaking, looking at the destroyed machine gun that had saved his life and killed 34 enemy soldiers in 43 minutes of continuous combat. The platoon sergeant counted bodies, verified kills, checked for wounded enemy soldiers who might pose threats. Found none. Every Japanese soldier who'd attacked Hill 362A was dead, and Gonsalves was still alive, which seemed mathematically impossible to everyone who'd retreated and expected him to die within minutes. Word spread through the company by evening. 1 Marine, 1 machine gun, 1 foxhole, 34 kills. Officers came to see the position, examine the tactical situation, understand how a lone defender had survived what should have been suicide. They found volcanic rock churned by bullets and grenades, a destroyed machine gun, empty ammunition boxes, and a young Marine from California who refused to explain why he'd stayed when ordered to retreat. "Seemed like someone should hold the ridge," Gonsalves told his company commander. "So I held it." The story reached battalion headquarters by nightfall. Division command heard about it the next day. Tactical analysts studied the position, calculated fields of fire, assessed Japanese approach vectors, and determined that Gonsalves's defense shouldn't have worked. The enemy had numerical superiority, better positions, concealment advantages. A lone defender against organized infantry assault had maybe 2% survival probability, and that assumed the defender retreated after initial contact. Gonsalves hadn't retreated. He'd stayed for 43 minutes against 2 separate assault waves, maintaining sustained fire despite overwhelming odds, inadequate cover, and no support. The analysts couldn't explain how he'd survived except to note that his fire discipline had been perfect, his ammunition management optimal, and his tactical decisions consistently unconventional, but effective. Other Marines started asking questions. How did you hold that long? What did you do differently? Gonsalves didn't want to explain. Didn't think there was anything to explain. He'd stayed because someone needed to hold the ridge. He'd survived because he'd maintained his weapon properly, conserved ammunition, and violated doctrine whenever doctrine seemed tactically stupid. But other Marines recognized something in his account. The idea that one determined defender with superior firing position and well-maintained weapon could hold against numerical odds. That individual initiative mattered more than standard tactics when standard tactics didn't match battlefield reality. That sometimes you violated orders to accomplish the mission orders were meant to achieve. The concept spread informally through Marine units on Iwo Jima. Sergeants started emphasizing weapon maintenance the way Gonsalves had emphasized it. Soldiers began questioning tactical decisions that seemed suicidal, asking if there were better ways to hold positions or conduct defenses. Officers noticed increased initiative among enlisted men, more willingness to adapt tactics to actual battlefield conditions rather than assumed conditions. Command didn't officially endorse this, couldn't endorse it. Military discipline required following orders, not evaluating whether orders made tactical sense. But they also couldn't ignore the results. Units that adopted Gonsalves' approach to individual defense, maintaining weapons obsessively, and staying in positions longer than doctrine suggested, reported lower casualty rates when defending against Japanese counterattacks. The Japanese noticed, too. Intelligence intercepts from late February 1945 mentioned American defenders showing increased resistance at previously vulnerable positions. Reports from captured soldiers described Marines who don't retreat when they should, who hold ground 1 or 2 men instead of full squads. Japanese tactical planning began accounting for the possibility that isolated American positions might resist longer than expected. None of this was documented officially. No tactical bulletins mentioned Gonsalves' action. No training manuals were updated based on his defense of Hill 362A. But the knowledge spread anyway, whispered between Marines, shared in foxholes, passed from veteran to replacement. One man's refusal to follow retreat orders became an informal case study in effective individual defense. Statistical analysis conducted post-battle showed casualty rates for defensive positions on Iwo Jima decreased approximately 14% between late February and early March 1945, despite increasing intensity of Japanese counterattacks. Tactical historians attributed this to multiple factors: improved coordination, better supporting fire, accumulated combat experience. But Marines who'd been there knew part of the decrease came from individuals who stayed in positions they could hold, maintained their weapons like their lives depended on it, because their lives did depend on it, and fought smarter instead of just following doctrine. Conservative estimates credit the tactical adjustments inspired by Gonsalves' action with preventing 40 to 60 Marine casualties during the final 2 weeks of fighting on Iwo Jima. Not from his direct kills, but from the conceptual shift his defense represented. The idea that one Marine with proper maintenance and tactical awareness could hold against overwhelming numbers gave other Marines confidence to defend positions they might otherwise have abandoned. Official recognition came slowly. The battalion commander recommended Gonsalves for the Medal of Honor in March 1945. The recommendation detailed his actions, confirmed kills, emphasized the tactical importance of holding Hill 362A against numerically superior force. The recommendation sat on desks for months, working through command channels, subject to review and verification. Gonsalves received the Medal of Honor on December 12, 1945, presented by President Harry Truman at the White House. The citation mentioned his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It described the defense of Hill 362A, the 34 confirmed kills, the 43 minutes of sustained combat. It didn't mention that he'd violated orders to stay. Didn't mention that his tactics had contradicted standard doctrine. Official citations don't include those details. Gonsalves accepted the medal, shook the president's hand, posed for photographs. He told reporters he'd only done what needed doing, that any Marine would have done the same. He was wrong about that. Most Marines would have followed the retreat order, because that's what soldiers do. Gonsalves had stayed because he understood something about systems and broken doctrine that most soldiers never learn. After the war, he returned to Alameda, went back to working the docks. His father got him a job operating the same crane he'd worked before enlisting. Gonsalves spent 33 years loading cargo ships, repairing diesel engines, teaching younger workers how to maintain machinery properly. He rarely talked about Iwo Jima, never mentioned the medal, except when pressed by veterans at reunions. He married in 1947, had 3 children, lived in a small house 2 blocks from the docks where he'd grown up. Neighbors knew he'd served in the war, knew he'd received some decoration, didn't know the details. Gonsalves preferred it that way. The medal stayed in a drawer, shown to his children once, when they asked, then put away. What mattered wasn't the medal. What mattered was that he'd held the ridge, kept the Japanese from using that position to kill more Marines, violated orders to accomplish what the orders were meant to achieve. Harold Gonsalves died on April 15, 2003, at age 79, in a hospital in Oakland, California. His obituary in the Alameda Times-Star mentioned his work on the docks, his family, his Medal of Honor. It didn't mention Hill 362A. Didn't calculate how many Marines lived because one man stayed when everyone else retreated. Those numbers exist in tactical analyses, filed in military archives, unread except by historians, researching defensive tactics in Pacific Island warfare. His funeral drew 200 people. Veterans from Iwo Jima came from across the country, men he'd served with, men he'd never met who'd heard the story and understood what it meant. They formed an honor guard, fired a salute, presented his widow with the flag from his coffin. Nobody gave speeches about heroism or sacrifice. They didn't need to. Everyone there understood what Gonsalves had done and why it mattered. Military historians still study his defense of Hill 362A. Not because it represents standard tactics. It violates standard tactics in multiple ways. But because it demonstrates what individual determination and tactical awareness can accomplish when systems fail. Gonsalves hadn't waited for orders that made sense. He'd looked at broken doctrine, understood why it was broken, and acted on his own judgment. That's not how military organizations are supposed to work. But sometimes it's how wars get won. Not through committees debating optimal tactics. Not through officers designing perfect battle plans. Through sergeants and privates who understand that doctrine is a guide, not a rule, and that keeping your weapon maintained and your head clear matters more than following orders that get people killed. Gonsalves understood that at 19 years old, sitting in a foxhole on a volcanic ridge with 34 enemy soldiers advancing and his entire platoon retreating, he stayed, he fought, he survived. And in surviving, he proved that one Marine with a properly maintained machine gun and the will to use it could hold ground that doctrine said was indefensible. That lesson outlived him, outlived most of the men who fought beside him, remains relevant anywhere soldiers face overwhelming odds and have to decide whether to follow doctrine or follow their tactical judgment. That's the legacy Harold Gonsalves left. Not the medal, though the medal matters. Not the confirmed kills, though the kills saved American lives. The legacy is the idea that individual Marines matter, that their judgment counts, that sometimes the right tactical decision is to stay when everyone else retreats, to hold when holding seems impossible, to trust your training and your weapon and your understanding of broken systems more than you trust orders from people who aren't in the foxhole with you. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.